Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again John Rubino. I imagine most everybody out there knows who John Rubino is. He's been on this show a number of times, and he's certainly, for anybody that's out there looking at the markets from a free market perspective, you would know the name John Rubino. He runs the popular website dollarcollapse.com, and I guess that's the place people should go to really get in touch with what all John is doing. But he's also been involved with writing a number of books. He co-authored with James Turk, our friend James, the Gold Money's James Turk, which is now BitGold, or it is still Gold Money, but anyway, it is combined now with BitGold. The Money Bubble was the name of a book, What to Do Before It Pops. And another author, he also authored a book called Clean Money, Picking Winners in the Green Tech Boom. The Collapse of the Dollar was also with James Turk. How to Profit from the Coming Real Estate Bust. I'm wondering if there's another one coming up. We might ask him. And Main Street, Not Wall Street. So John has had an extensive background in the financial markets. He worked on Wall Street for a while as an MBA from New York University a few years back. And during the 1990s, he was a featured columnist with TheStreet.com and a frequent contributor to Individual Investor, Online Investor, and Consumer Digest, among many other publications. So he currently also writes for CFA Magazine. Thanks, John, for joining me today. It's good to have you again.
Good to be back, Jay.
Always good to talk to you. We've titled our show today, Do We Need World War III to Get Us Out of this Fed-Created Depression? So, the mainstream media always presents an optimistic picture of the global economy. I mean, there's no need to go to war for that reason, according to the mainstream. I mean, we have many other reasons. We've got an evil guy named Putin. We have an evil dictator in North Korea. We have bad people, some bad people, at least bad now, and we might redefine them as good in the future, or vice versa in the Middle East. We have China, which is supposed to be an ominous threat to us here in the United States, all of these things. But there's no reason that we would go to war because our economy is actually pretty good, is what we're told when I turn on CNBC and Bloomberg and so forth. But let's talk about the U.S. economy for a moment. John, how would you characterize it?
Well, we've got a little bit of a recovery going on here, at least in terms of top-line numbers. But the important thing to understand is that nothing exists just in and of itself. Whatever you've got, you have to look at what you had to pay to get it, right, before you know whether you've done well. And in the U.S., we borrowed absolutely insane amounts of money over the last 6 or 7 years to hold what would have been a global depression at bay. And so, we've got a few more new jobs in the U.S. now than we used to, and GDP is growing. It's kind of clawing along at 1 or 2% a year, which is a positive number. Mm-hmm. But we had to borrow so much to get this that we actually dug ourselves into an even deeper hole. For instance, a lot of the jobs that have been created in the last few years have been in the service sector, that is, bartenders and waiters. Relatively few have been created in manufacturing, good paying, unionized, possibly factory jobs. And we have had to borrow about 10 times the annual salary of these bartenders that we've been hiring in order to create each one of those new jobs. Mm-hmm. So we didn't end up doing ourselves any favor by pursuing the policies that we pursued. For instance, the U.S. is kind of like a family. Let's say, Jay, you lose your job. Yeah. And you and Teresa, instead of cutting back, decide to maintain your lavish New York City lifestyle by putting everything on credit cards. Well, everything looks normal for a while. It looks like you're basically okay because you've got all the same stuff, you're doing the same things, but that credit card debt is building up year after year after year. And at some point, everything's going to change because one of those cards will refuse to extend you more credit, or you'll default on something or other, and then the repo man will come and take everything away. Well, that's the U.S. right now. We're extending and pretending by borrowing huge amounts of money to maintain a lifestyle that we can't maintain from our own productive capacity. And at some point, that blows up on us. And it's not clear when, might be next year, might be 5 years from now, but the repo man is coming because we can't pay our debts. And we're actually in better shape than a lot of the rest of the world. If you look at Japan or Europe or China right now, you have to say that they are closer to the edge of the cliff than we are in a lot of ways. So we have a global depression that will probably, by historians, be dated from around 2000, when the tech stock bubble burst, that we've been keeping at bay by borrowing more and more money year after year. But at some point, we'll lose the ability to continue to borrow money on these terms, and then everything will fall apart. And then we'll say, oh, yeah, maybe we should have done something different after the tech stock bubble. But by then, it'll be way too late.
Yeah. Would it be way too late? So it's a lackluster economy that is being, let's say, oxygen is being breathed into it through debt, and as you point out, it's taking more and more debt to create those sort of jobs that aren't really wealth-creating jobs; they're service jobs. And but what is it? Is it translating yet, John, into the earnings of companies? That companies, to a great extent, have been able to keep their per-share earnings up by buying back stock, by going out and they're borrowing money at low prices to buy the stock and buy back their stock. And, of course, bookkeeping gimmicks and also by cutting costs. But as you say, to what extent top-line revenues have not been doing very well, from what I understand. It's a lackluster economy, but you wouldn't know it from the stock market, basically, for the most part. Although, as Michael Oliver pointed out earlier, the equity market isn't all that great, really, if you go back and look at it for the last few years. But you have a sense that, if you listen to the mainstream media, you have the sense that things are, well, they're okay. We're gonna be right there. We're gonna do very well. Just keep buying stocks. What is your view of the equity market now? Well,
the stock market has been inflated by all the money that we're pumping into the banking system. When the Federal Reserve creates new dollars, they hand it to the big banks. The big banks give it to their preferred customers, who are basically, the rich guys out there who already have most of the stuff that they need. So they park that money in treasury bonds and blue chip equities and bid up the prices of financial assets. And at the same time, as you said, corporations have been doing financial engineering in order to make their earnings look much better than they actually are. One of the things they've been doing is firing their U.S.-based workers and transferring a lot of that work to China, where it's much cheaper, and getting a tax break for the related costs for this process. And at the same time, they borrow money for next to nothing, and then they turn around and buy back their outstanding stock, which pushes up the price of that stock and makes the earnings per share a little higher, and which not incidentally increases the year-end bonus for most of the executives involved in running the company. Right. But a lot of this stuff it has a limited time frame in which it can work. You can only borrow so much money to buy back your stock before you've bought back all your stock and done a leverage buyout, right? So that can't go on forever. And if you don't invest in new plant and equipment, which U.S. companies are not to the extent that they should be, then your company gets older and less efficient and less profitable in the long run. So a lot of what's happening now is basically these companies are being looted by their current managements, and they're leaving a mess for their successors. So that's going to reflect on the stock market in the long run, or in the intermediate term, in lower earnings, and therefore probably lower share prices out there somewhere. But leaning against that trend is all the new money coming in from the world's central banks, and it has to go somewhere. So it's possible that even as the world's equity markets deteriorate in terms of quality of earnings and total earnings and virtually everything else that you would normally look at as a valuation measure for equities, that they will continue to go up just because there's money pouring out of these central banks. So what's really happening is we're devaluing our currencies versus corporations. In other words, the dollar gets less valuable, therefore General Motors stock goes up, but it's really the dollar going down. And the stock is not necessarily becoming more valuable in real terms. So at some point, that also blows up. And again, there's no way to know when, but you're seeing signs of that trend rolling over. Corporations are buying back a little less stock than they used to. They're borrowing a little bit less money. The trend is starting to inflect a bit. And more importantly, the stocks of some of the biggest share repurchasers are starting to underperform the market now. So that means that trend might finally have peaked and might be rolling over.
We're certainly seeing a lot of internals in the markets and divergencies. I would say David Stockman was talking recently about how just a handful of companies are tech companies primarily that are holding up the NASDAQ and so forth. So one wonders how long this can go on. But, John, you mentioned that it's the rich people, it's the 1%ers, or the 1/10 of 1%ers that are really, really sort of skimming everything off the top, it seems. And the vast majority of Americans, more on food stamps, more on, living hand to mouth, more, I forget, I saw a number recently about how many Americans have less than $1,000 saved up and probably a lot of debt on top of that to boot. So you have to wonder at some point it starts to wear on the body politic internally, and if we look around the world internationally as well. I believe very firmly, and I think that you are in agreement with this, that the petrodollar is a very important part of this whole story, that we need to have, the dollar needs to have a bid under it, and part of that bid, as Henry Kissinger made sure would happen after Nixon took us off the gold standard, was to have Saudi Arabia and the oil countries purchasing their oil using dollars to purchase the oil. Now, there are people in the world there are countries in the world, namely Russia and China and others, that are not so keen about using dollars, and they're starting to compete against that. There's this notion, we talked to Gene Epstein about it just a moment ago, the notion that we got ourselves out of World War II with a war, with the global economy showing more weakness and just not doing well. Do you think that might heighten the chance of some very serious conflict? And we notice that there does seem to be growing geopolitical conflict between ourselves and Russia and China and places like that.
Well, okay, there are two major parts to that question, Jay. And the first is, does a big war do good things economically? And that's an unequivocal no. There is no positive aspect to war from an economic standpoint. And the way you get out of a depression is you let the debt be liquidated that got you into the depression in the first place, and then when enough debt has been liquidated and assets are cheap enough, the people who have maintained capital through this process come in, buy up a lot of cheap assets, put them to work, and the economy starts growing again in a sustainable way. That's just the way the business cycle works, and there's no getting around that. In a capitalist economy, you have the occasional boom, the occasional bust, and if you let the bust liquidate enough of the malinvestment and bad debt, you start growing again. And overall, over time, you end up growing strongly as it's possible to grow, and creating as much wealth as it's possible to create without government intervention. The second part of the question is, are we behaving the way we're behaving geopolitically now because we're worried about our domestic economy? And that is the way the world works. When a country is badly run and its people are becoming restive, governments frequently look abroad for some kind of an enemy to distract their people with. And so you're seeing the whole world do that now. China is making trouble completely unnecessarily in the South China Sea, and the Middle East is on fire right now, and Russia and the U.S. are kind of bombing each other's surrogates. We're in grave danger of making a mistake over there where one of us accidentally shoots down one of the other's planes, just like Turkey just did with the Russian plane, and we still don't know the full story behind that. But it is kind of heating up around the world, and probably a big part of that is that domestically, all of these countries are so precarious right now. We've got serious domestic problems, impending financial crises pretty much everywhere you look. And so historically, that leads to geopolitical tensions. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this is happening, but it should be terrifying. Just lately, some stories have been coming out about the new super weapons that are being developed. Russia has, so they say, a super torpedo that can detonate a nuclear warhead off the coast of an enemy country and cause a radioactive tsunami that wipes out a city and then irradiates the surrounding ground for decades afterwards. And they've got some kind of a ray gun, a super jammer that shuts down all electronic communication in the direction that they point it. So it would stop, for instance, cruise missiles from coming in against them. But it would also, I think, take down commercial airliners and blind satellites and do all kinds of things that would be terrifying for an opposing military or an opposing country in general. And the U.S. now is developing autonomous submarines, cheap little drone-like subs that they're going to just send out into the ocean to do whatever, to track other countries' subs, and presumably, eventually, will arm them and have them be able to attack other countries' subs and ships. So now we're going to have an ocean, if this works out, that'll be like the skies over Afghanistan or something, where you never know if something is just going to attack you out of the blue. So, and that's just the three things that have been announced lately. Presumably, they're working on some other really terrifying super weapons. And the fact that they're being announced now is a form of mutually assured destruction, where they're saying, whoever is announcing this is saying, look, don't attack us, don't mess with us, because we can do things to you that maybe you didn't realize we could do. Well, here. And so this is another part of the conflict that's happening on a lot of different levels now between the U.S. and China and Russia and to an extent Europe and, of course, the Middle East, where everybody's kind of jockeying for position now. And it's obviously not clear how all this shakes out. And the worst case scenario for what we're starting right now is pretty horrendous. So hopefully we don't ever get to that point. But this is the kind of thing that leads to crazy stuff. This feels a lot like the beginning of World War I, where you had people doing things that in and of themselves aren't globally significant, but that lead to things that can be globally significant. And so hopefully we're not doing anything like the Austrians declaring war on Serbia because a Serbian assassinated a Austrian archduke, and that precipitating World War I. We're on the verge of doing things like that, for instance, in the Middle East. And hopefully we don't take the next set of steps that lead us further down that path.
Yeah. Well, certainly the downing of the Russian airliner, supposedly by ISIS, and also, of course, the downing of the Russian fighter jet the other day by Turkey, certainly has got people really worried. I think rightfully worried. But I hear, John, you listen to the Republican debates, you hear nothing but anger about a president who hasn't been tough enough, and they're blaming Obama for all of the problems that we have. I mean, the neocons think that the reason we're having all these wars is because we have a Neville Chamberlain in our White House. That we need to be tough, and we have to let them know. One of the questions and concerns that I have, John, is that the notion, and we hear some of the neocons almost crying for World War III. They're almost saying, "Bring it on. We can do it. We're greater than you. We have everything we need. We just had a limp-wristed president in the White House. Now all we need is some tough guy in there that will really set things right and let people know that America is still in charge of the world." And but I'm wondering, do you think that these new weapons that are being created, are they likely to deter, or could they actually get people to think, now we have a way that we can win this thing and launch the first strike?
Hopefully they're a deterrent, but who knows what these guys are thinking. I mean, that it's reached this point kind of implies that you've got a lot of overconfident people out there, or people who are so terrified of their domestic situation that they're willing to risk a big war to distract their people. But when you've got this many moving parts in a situation, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen next. And yeah, you're right. In the U.S., we've got some bloodthirsty chicken hawks out there who would love to flat out declare war on one or two other countries just because they believe we can get away with it. But that's really that's an artifact of a historical accident. Really, after World War II, because the war had happened in a different place, we were relatively unscathed, and we ended up being the most powerful country in the world. And we've parlayed that into a global military empire using the world's reserve currency, which we basically borrowed against to the point that we're functionally bankrupt. But leaving that aside, we still think with just 5% of the world's population that we have preordained right to dominate the world. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing that gets empires in trouble. When you overreach and you think that because you've won your last few battles, you're untouchable. And because you've been able to borrow as much money as you wanted up until this point, you can borrow as much money as you want forever and finance whatever adventure you feel like financing. And that historically tends to turn out not to be true.
Yeah.
The Roman Empire... Oh, go ahead.
I'd love to go on. We're just about out of time. I have to ask you, John, we've been talking about these potential dangers, the economic dangers as well as outright war. But you make a good point, and we were talking earlier today, that it's at times like these, it's if you can see the future or see what's coming and prepare for it, you can actually come out potentially you can come out ahead and be better off for it. Give us a little optimism here, John. Can you give us some idea of what we should be doing to help us prepare for the difficulties that might lie ahead?
Sure, Jay. There are two reasons for optimism. One is that, crisis equals opportunity, as the old saying goes. So the things that are going to happen inevitably from all this debt we've taken on are fairly predictable in the broad sense. And one of the things that is going to happen is massive currency devaluation around the world. So you can set yourself up to make a lot of money from that process. And one way to do that is to own a lot of precious metals, because they are the old forms of money that governments can't create in infinite quantities and that tend to go up versus the national currencies that are being devalued. So that's one thing. There are many, many others. And then looking further out, when we hit bottom, and when the old way of doing things has been discredited, and we hopefully create a more sustainable system going forward, there are going to be some amazing technologies out there, starting with solar power and moving on through biotech and artificial intelligence and lots of other things that are going to be the growth industries of the next century. And then we can take our precious metals profits, roll them into solar power and biotech stocks, and make another fortune. So it's possible, starting now, to have a really good 10 years.
All right, John, I think you've given us some good things to think about. I want to thank you very much. We are out of time, unfortunately. We could go on forever with you. Thank you so much for being with us. So we will actually address some of those issues, John, next week when we talk to Chris Martenson and Adam Taggart on this show about their book, Prosper. They have a lot of great ideas, not just financial capital, but all kinds of other social capital and things that you can do to prepare for difficult times. But I would love to have you join us sometime, because I know you have a lot of great ideas, too. But thank you so much for being with us, John. Always great to have you.